Great, so we're going to go ahead and get started for today. As people are joining, please feel free to drop your name, where you're at, who you're with in the chat box, and we'll go ahead and get started. So first, my name is Carrie. I want to welcome you to Addressing the Intersection of Substance Use and Housing, specific to parents and guardians. I am the moderator for today's webinar, and I am with Freedom Network USA. We are joined with our lovely presenters, Katie Spriggs and Gabriela Zapata-Alma, and we're excited to have you. Next slide, please. Just a couple logistical things before we go ahead and get started. We are using the Q&A feature on the platform today, so if you have any questions on content throughout, please feel free to drop those questions in the Q&A function, and we'll answer throughout the presentation, as well as have Q&A at the end of our content today. We are also utilizing the chat feature. Just be mindful to select all panelists and attendees if you want to share that out with everyone. And then if you have specific panelist questions and or tech issues, please feel free to direct message us through the chat function. We also have closed captioning available today for our presentation. So again, there should be a feature for you to select that. And all of our presentation today will be recorded, and slides will be shared out a couple weeks after our session today. Go ahead and go next slide. Just want to again welcome you that our presentation today is put on by Freedom Network Training Institute, specifically our Housing Training and Technical Assistance Project. So this this project is funded by the Office of Victims of Crime. We provide support and resources to service providers such as yourselves and or community members on understanding and connecting to housing options for survivors of trafficking. We host quarterly webinars. We focus on different topics on intersections of housing and human trafficking. We can provide one-on-one technical assistance to OVC grantees and their partners. We also have a resource library with different fact sheets, webinar recordings that you can find at freedomnetworkusa.org. And you can sign up for our listserv to also receive notifications from there. So please take a look at those if you would like any other access to previous webinars and resources. Next slide, please. So here to welcome our presenters before we kick it over to them for content. Just to also be mindful of time, we won't be going into their full bios. Those are accessible in the registration email. So thank you, Katie Spriggs, for being here. She's Executive Director out of Eastern Panhandle Empowerment Center. And again, thank you, Gabriela Zapata-Alma, for being here today. She's the Director of Policy and Practice at the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. And I'm going to go ahead and kick it over to Katie.
Awesome. Thank you, Carrie, and thanks everyone for having us. So quick introduction on me and what we do here at EPIC. I am Katie Spriggs. As she said, I am the Executive Director. Eastern Panhandle Empowerment Center is a dual program, meaning in West Virginia, how we classify those is we serve victims of domestic violence and sexual assault. Some programs are separate. We also serve survivors of human trafficking and stalking. You can see our mission there, and we do run and operate a 16-bed emergency shelter and a rapid rehousing program, as well as outreach services.
Hey everyone, so I'm Gabriela, and just a little bit about the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. Here are some of those services that we offer. We are a national resource center dedicated to the intersection of DV, sexual violence, trauma, substance use, and mental health. And then you see here as well our integrated framework that we are rooted within survivor-defined approaches, relationship and connection, fostering hope and resilience, and self-defined physical and emotional safety. And then everything else we do really emerges from that core. Back to you, Katie.
All right, so we're going to talk a little bit in the beginning about what we'll be focusing on today. So we'll just go through each one. We're gonna be honoring survivor-driven needs and solutions. So everything that we talk about, we're gonna talk about it today under that lens. We're also gonna talk about how substance use concerns are linked to surviving human trafficking and trauma, what is the intersection of all of those pieces. We're gonna talk about taking a matter-of-fact approach to substance use, helping survivors safety plan and mitigate potential harms in relation to substance use, and of course, linked to trafficking. Meeting the person where they are and offering relevant and age-appropriate support, talking about how there is no wrong way to approach this work, and collaborating with substance use resources. So how do you find who's in your area? How do you collaborate within those programs? And then our second part of this session, we're going to overview the intersections of substance use and housing, specifically focused on how they relate to parenting concerns within families and children, and provide some practical examples and takeaway of best practices when you are working with parents and caregivers, and how do you support them within your various housing models, all the way from, like we said, shelter to, you know, independent living, rapid rehousing, whatever program you might offer. And then we're also going to go over some case examples that help navigate the system.
So first, looking at the prevalence of parental substance use and the potential concerns that might come up. So first, we're going to start with looking at what is the general prevalence of alcohol use in general, right? And so here we see that in the US, this is US specific and comes from SAMHSA's national survey, that there are almost 140 people who consume alcohol in one way or another. And then you also see here the number of people who use alcohol in a style that is considered to be a binge style, as well as a heavy style. And you see some of the definitions here. So binge alcohol use is for male identified individuals, 5 or more drinks per occasion. For feminine identified individuals, 4 or more drinks on occasion. We also know that in the pandemic, alcohol use has increased. So there is a report from Nielsen that showed a 54% increase in national alcohol sales during the week ending March 21st, 2020. So right at the beginning. We also know that online sales of alcohol increased 262% comparing 2019 and 2020. And then there was a survey of 6,000 people that showed that 75% of the survey respondents said that they had increased their alcohol use during the pandemic. And so what this tells us is a few things, right? First, alcohol use in general has increased. But it also really makes clear the relationship between alcohol use and challenging times, large-scale trauma, as well as personal trauma. And then looking at substances other than alcohol. Here, this data comes again from SAMHSA's national survey. And the red bar is people who would meet criteria for a substance use disorder, a diagnosable substance use disorder. And then the blue bar is people who have used some kind of, substance aside from alcohol or caffeine or tobacco, right, in the past year. And so as you can see, the vast majority of people who have used an illicit substance don't actually meet criteria for a substance use disorder. And this is something that we don't often talk about and that we don't often focus on in our conversations about substance use, in our research about substance use. And so one thing that we want to be really sure of is that when there is substance use present, that we aren't jumping to conclusions, that we aren't assuming that that means that there's a diagnosable substance use disorder, or that this is somehow posing some kind of problem in this person's life or for the well-being of their family. Now, what we do know as well is that during the pandemic, accidental fatal overdoses have really increased, have tragically increased. The largest single year jump that we have ever seen, with overdose fatalities at over 30% higher than the previous year. So we went into this thing in the grips of a drug poisoning epidemic, and we are still in that drug poisoning epidemic. We also know that accidental fatal overdose disproportionately impacts communities of color, that many Black Americans are disproportionately impacted by fatal overdose due to opioids, as well as many of our Indigenous relatives are disproportionately impacted by overdose related to methamphetamine. And this isn't related to necessarily differences in rates of use, but in all the other contextual factors, including health conditions and just all the ways that structural violence plays out in our communities. And so I say this to say that overdose prevention is key and is a racial equity issue. And so now going from that big picture and zeroing in on parents and caregivers. So about 8.7 million, or 1 in 8 children in the US lived with at least one parent who had a diagnosable substance use disorder. And this was 1 in 10 lived with a parent who had a diagnosable alcohol use disorder, and 1 in 35 lived with a parent who had a diagnosable substance use disorder that was not related to alcohol. And so some things to keep in mind is that this kind of shouldn't be shocking, that this is actually part of the reality of a lot of families. And so rather than kind of devolving into stigma, we want to be sure to be safe supports and to be prepared to support parents, caregivers, and their children without judgment, without the shock factor, without the stigma that is so rampant in our society. So when it comes to child well-being, parental substance use is associated with an increased risk of contact with child welfare systems, including increased reports of abuse or neglect and out-of-home placements. In some communities, it's as high as 60% of out-of-home placements are what is cited is substance use. But the research is unclear. The evidence is not clear here on how much of it is due to the substance use itself versus everything else that people are dealing with, including housing instability, poverty, trauma, resource barriers, and social isolation. And we know that part of the risk profile as well as the effects of trafficking are that social isolation, right? And so again, here we want to be really careful of any kinds of assumptions and not jumping to conclusions that any kind of barriers that we're seeing to for the family that the family may be experiencing, we don't want to jump to conclusions and blame it on the presence of substance use or assume that it's because substance use is involved or that substance use is involved to begin with. That whenever this has been looked at, it's really hard to pull apart these different factors. Something else that we do know that is very clear in the research is that drug testing does not measure a child's safety or well-being, right? And this information here comes from the Child Welfare Information Gateway. You see the citation there, and you're welcome to check it out and read more about it. So drug testing does not tell us anything about a child's safety or well-being, but what we also have found in the research is that when there is a positive drug screen, so when somebody is given a drug test and they test positive for the presence of drugs, that the finding of there being child abuse or neglect increases exponentially even when the case facts remain the same. And so when we are supporting folks, when we are advocating for folks, our role really needs to be to counter that stigma and to help navigate these systems if these systems do become involved, and to really focus on child safety and family well-being rather than just focusing on whether or not a parent is using substances. And now I will pass it over to Katie.
So now we're going to look at some potential concerns that might come up surrounding parenting with the existence of substance use also in the picture. So we're obviously going to talk about physical or mental impairments from use, and how does those impairments affect their ability to parent? Do they affect their ability to parent? Reduced capacity to respond to the children's cues. So are the children still getting what they need, or is the substance use impairing to the point where that's not happening? Difficulty regulating emotions, anger, impulsivity, which a lot of these you might be thinking, I worry about these things when serving survivors of trauma just in general, right? Like somebody who is going through human trafficking, has been admitted into a shelter, they're living in communal living. All of those things are trauma. And all of those things we're already talking about when we're talking about serving survivors. disruptions in healthy attachment between parents and children. Where are they using the funds, diverting funds to the substance instead of other needs, diverting time to obtaining or making substances, of course, incarceration, and estrangement from support systems, which is one of the largest barriers that you might face when working with survivors who are using substances, or really just survivors in general. You might be thinking, like, that's something I see all the time. Oh, and Gabriella, feel free to jump in and add anything at any point. So we talked about how we would discuss the intersection, right? Because nothing happens on its own, especially in this field. So there's a pretty significant intersection between parenting alone and human trafficking. Oftentimes traffickers might use the children as a coercive tactic against the survivor, particularly in cases where there might have been systems involvement before, and that involvement caused harm. So, for example, it could look like a trafficker saying, if you flee, if you leave, I will call Child Protective Services and let them know about how horrible of a parent you are, or these things that you do. And if that system has caused harm before, that's a very real threat, even if it hasn't, right? They might have fear of judgment when opening up to helping professionals about trafficking because of the large stigma surrounding it, and because of maybe failed system interactions before. We have worked with countless survivors who have told us that they have no interest in involving a system. Let's pick one, the criminal justice system. They have no interest in involving the criminal justice system because I've reported 3 other times before, and one time I was laughed at, the second time I wasn't believed, the third time I was arrested. So they have zero interest in interacting with the system anymore. And then protective of children, there's a potential for a misperception and judgment by helping professionals that just because someone was experiencing human trafficking, they were somehow failing to protect their children. We just had a conversation in our office this morning around that misconception and how really, truly very hard it is to overcome. And the fact that protecting children looks differently depending on the context of the violence and the resources that are available to every individual. So it truly is contextual. So now we're going to move on to supporting parents and caregivers and their children that are impacted by substance use within your programs, within your housing program specifically. So some ways that you could start, right? Some starting points. Acknowledging the stigma and using non-judgmental language is really the first part. So learning how to speak the language in a non-judgmental way. There's really handy charts that are available. I mean, it's just to simple Google search, how to use proper language surrounding substance use. Refraining from guilt or shame-based approaches. You don't need to instill any shame in someone that's going to add to their negative view of helping professionals, right? Emphasize their strengths and promote resilience. Survivors who have made it to your program are resilient, right? And acknowledge that whatever they have done up until this point to keep themselves and their children alive is significant and worth celebrating. Respect them as a parent, right? They are the parent of that child or the caregiver of that child. Facilitate timely access to desired resources and services. There's no need to make someone wait for a service that maybe they don't have to, or to reduce access just because of substance use. Peer-based support is just incredibly important. There might be an already peer-based support program in your community that you could look up. You could start one. Do you have support groups within your program? Are any of those support groups focused on substance use at the intersection of trauma? And then you're gonna search for and promote whatever protective factors they might have. And again, that's sort of individualized. Everyone has different protective factors, but you want to feel those out rather than focusing on only the risk factors.
So we're going to share some of the protective factors that have been found across the literature. At the same time, there are so many more protective factors than what has just been kind of documented in literature. So this is just a starting place, right? To get those wheels turning, to start thinking about how does our program already support and are based on the strengths that are present and really foster the kind of nurturing of these protective factors, and what's missing, what could we add, right? As well as what are the individual and community cultural strengths of folks that we are working with. So looking at individual protective factors, here what's been found across research is a sense of purpose, a sense of optimism, which we want to be careful, right? Because we don't want to be kind of silver lining all of the harm and hardship that someone has experienced and many times continues to experience, right? We don't want to sugarcoat it, but what we want to do is be aware, be listening, and noticing these protective factors, and then really strengthening them. Self-regulation skills. And that is kind of just a fancy way of saying, how can we kind of support and engage folks with modeling our own self-regulation, right? That if we're not kind of modeling our own self-regulation, then we can't really support that in other folks, as well as helping to co-regulate. And then freely sharing things like mind-body practices, having art materials available, things that really help folks to kind of step out of their head for a moment and help them feel a sense of control within themselves, right? Relational skills, problem-solving skills, and then just overall involvement in positive activities as the person defines that for themselves. And that these have been found effective across ages. So for children, not just for adults. And here's one resource that can be helpful in fostering some of these individual protective factors, particularly in children. And so there is the National Association for Children of Addiction, and they have a lot of different resources. We'll be naming a couple more from them later on. But one is this poster that you can download, you can print out, you can have it posted places, and it's called the 7 C's. It's talking specifically about, the 7 C's relate to a parent's substance use. But that said, I find that it is so relevant to really any kind of life problem that a child may be experiencing, right? I didn't cause it. I can't control it. I can't cure it, but I can help take care of myself by communicating my feelings, making healthy choices, and celebrating me. Back to you.
So now we're going to focus on some protective factors that exist within relationships with the children. So parenting competencies, what level of competencies are they already aware of in parenting? In what areas would they like to see themselves have more knowledge, right? If you ask any parent, I'm sure they're going to say they have space to learn and here's things that they would like to learn. Could you set up movie nights, family movie nights, where the family gets together and watches a movie, you guys provide the snacks, and you're having a healthy activity between parents and children. Positive peer relationships are just as important across the line for the children and for the adults. And then model caring adult behavior within your program. So if mom's having a rough day, why not pull aside the kids and do a craft? Or can you bring in volunteers or staff or therapists to provide activities, to structured activities or not, with the kids? Consider what space you have. Do you have space to put in a toy room or a kid's room? Or what about for teenagers that might come into your program? What does their space look like? So you're looking at it as a bigger picture, and then also all the way down to what direct services could we implement that might provide some more relationship-based protective factors.
Yes, and one thing I'll add, right, is when it comes to those parenting competencies, Katie, I love how you talk about centering the parent or the caregiver in that conversation. We're not taking a cookie cutter approach. We're not coming in with a top-down approach saying, you have to do this parenting class or you need to learn how to be a parent, right? That like we are countering all of that power over and really focusing on power with and offering relevant services that are, that are relevant as defined by that person. And it makes me think about how, sometimes there's like a handbook, right? There's a participant handbook or a resident handbook, and it says like parents are responsible for their children. And it's like, okay, I think parents know that, right? Like they probably wouldn't have brought their children to the program with them if they didn't feel that they were responsible for their child. What might feel different is how they define that, right? As well as what is their access to choices and resources. Because a lot of times, if I'm making a decision as a caregiver or a parent that doesn't feel like maybe the best choice to somebody else, it's because that's actually the best choice that I could make in that moment. And what I need is access to self-defined helpful resources and support, not more judgment, not more labels, right?
So some community protective factors that you could work on implementing a positive community environment and making a positive, it's not always easy, especially in communal living, particularly if you're looking at in an emergency shelter type setting where you have multiple needs of multiple participants, often limited resources, limited space. But look at it, a positive community environment fosters like that sense of community for the parent. So making sure that parenting needs are prioritized within your program. Learning what's going on in your community and how do we get our participants involved? How do we get the community involved with our participants? Positive school environments, doing the research, learning what the school programs have. It could look something like locally here, we have some Boys and Girls Club programming, particularly in the summer, they take like field trips. So you could look at offering scholarships to those sorts of things to children in the shelter. They'll do family events, offering scholarships for families or providing the transportation, like the van leaves at 4 p.m. for a field trip day. And then, of course, you can't downplay the need for economic opportunities within the family and within the community. And how do you highlight those? And how do you make those accessible to the survivors in your program?
Yes. And this reminds me, Katie, of a time you shared with me where your program had offered some of these resources and the parent had kind of declined them. Could you share kind of what are some ways that your program was able to really stay survivor defined when maybe a parent turns down some of those resources?
Yeah, that happens pretty often. And often our, sort of approach to that, we did offer like scholarships to the Boys and Girls Club, and they said, no, I don't, I'm not really interested. I don't feel like we need that, is to bring it into the shelter. So where they were actually residing. So instead of asking the parent to, facilitate the exchange of time to take the children to and from, whatever, accompany them, bringing the resources into the building and making it incredibly accessible. And if anything, the parents have found that as helpful because it's a little bit of a break, right? It's either a break or it's someone helping. So like if you do, let's say, for example, a board game night, and the parents play along with the children, there's someone to facilitate that. There's someone else who had to deal with the setup of that, the acquiring of things, right? Like all of these little stressors that come up, someone else managed that and brought it and made it as accessible as possible, right? Where they live. Having our playground renovated. We have a playground in the backyard of our emergency shelter. Having it renovated and accessible, more accessible to parents. Also not expecting, so we sort of taken away the antiquated 1980s shelter rules. So like, for example, if a child is playing out on the playground and they're, at an age in which that is safe, 5, 6, 7, 8, the parent doesn't have to be out there, right underneath of them. They can be in the building doing parent things, right? Just as if we do at our houses. So facilitating an environment in which you can parent according to your own style, but then bringing the resources in and making them as accessible as possible.
Yes, and I love how you mentioned parenting style, right? Because I can think of, thinking about my parenting style compared to my neighbors, compared to my besties, right? We have similarities, we also have differences. And what kind of respect and grace are we offering parents to, first of all, to have just the natural diversity of parenting styles, and then also kind of how something like setting up a board game or saying we're going to play this board game tonight, it might seem like something small, but that when somebody is juggling so much and really is in crisis. I mean, a lot of times folks are coming to our housing programs having experienced a lot of harm and crisis, right? To be able to have kind of one less thing to worry about, right? It can really go a long way.
And an enjoyable moment with their families that they can share and talk about and reflect on. And it's, showing that truly small things make a difference in the long-term care.
Yes, we want to build up all of those positive connections and experiences. Absolutely.
And I saw there's a note in the chat that are there usually liability concerns around children. And I would just say that I mean, there's never an instance in our shelter facility where the care of the child's responsibility doesn't belong to someone. So just like in your home, if the parent is in the shelter with the child, then the parental responsibility, they don't have to watch them 24/7. You wouldn't expect a parent in their own home to take the child to the bathroom with them, or to log into a Zoom meeting for work with them, or any of these things. So sort of just holding that same standard, I think, mitigates really legal liability. And then we do have like a whole babysitting process that it's like a whole another training all by itself. That we have sort of vetted to ensure that, we're able to allow people the freedom to parent, but also like eliminate any potential legal liability.
Yeah, and as
so non-judgmental information. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, one thing I'll say is as you figure out those those basic safety limits within your own program, the most important thing is then just to communicate them in ways that are understandable for people. That if there are so many rules that the staff have a hard time following them or remembering what they are, then we can be very certain that people in the program are not going to be, they're just going to be so confusing, right? And then are we setting people up for failure at that point? So as you determine within your program, kind of what are those limits, then just being clear about those. And then if there is, any kind of falling short of that, having a supportive conversation rather than a punitive one, offering support, offering resources, not coming kind of at someone with confrontation or with judgment.
Right. For a simple example, instead of saying, why did you leave your child outside for 4 hours unaccompanied? What prevented you from having more interaction with your child today while they were playing outside? Or how could we facilitate an environment where you had the time or the energy, right, to go do these things? Like, so switching the sort of narrative of how you even invite these conversations, which is honestly the perfect segue to our non-judgmental information sharing section. So when you're offering information surrounding parenting needs, recovery resources, really any information that someone may want or need, the first part is make sure you have their permission. Like, hey, is it okay? I got this information, for you surrounding a relapse prevention plan, and I'm wondering if now, might be a good time to talk about it. Or do you have any interest in hearing about this? Or waiting until they request it. And what we have found to be incredibly helpful in starting these conversations is just off the bat, having a clear, open communication surrounding substances in the building. So, for example, at intake, you could say something like, this is something similar to what we do. We only have a few main, like hard and fast, quote, rules in the building. Number one, you can't have any, it's not number one, but it's on there. You cannot, use substances within this building. And we would appreciate it if you didn't bring them on the property. But if you do, if you have nowhere safe to store them, you'll be given a locker. Here's the location of your locker. Here's your code to get into your locker. No one else can get into your locker and assess it. And your locker will never be searched by staff. It's very helpful to just be very upfront. If you need harm reduction tools, so a clean needle, this is where you can access it. You can get it yourself, no questions asked. If you need to dispose of something, we have sharps containers here, here, and here. This is where you can do it. So like off the bat, coming at it with a matter-of-fact approach to harm reduction is incredibly helpful. I've never seen anything facilitate these conversations as well as that approach has. Just matter of fact, this is how you can access these resources that we have in this building. And then you'd be surprised at how easy the conversation flows because you've created an environment in which they can talk about it, right? Do you want to make sure that when you have these conversations, it's non-punitive and non-shaming? Accept it. We have a therapist here who I swear could write the book for it. She is a model at doing this, and she will have very open conversations with survivors about which substance are you using? Where do you get it? Do you have a safe place to access it? How do you transport it? Like very conversations about keeping everyone involved safe. Understand, have this conversation built on a trustworthy and supportive relationship that hopefully you've already built before this. How they may response to this information, be prepared for that, right? Think that through. Be prepared to have a follow-up conversation. Be prepared to have many follow-up conversations. Get ready to attend to any negative feelings or reactions they may experience, or between their own thoughts and feelings, between how other people treat them, and then come at the conversation with ideas and resources of what could help, right? You're not going to start the conversation with nowhere for it to end. And then just some useful, this is a really useful graphic. If you'd like to find it, Gabriella has inserted the image source, please feel free. But it's helpful ideas for reframing conversation starters, right? So let's say you have a client who is recently told you that they were pregnant and they're smoking. Instead of saying, now that you're pregnant, you need to stop smoking, you could say, what do you think about your smoking now that you're pregnant? Do you see how the same conversation is started, but in two completely different approaches? Another example, instead of saying, if you loved your children, you'd stop using, you could say, I know that you love your children. That's a fact. What can we do to help you parent them the way that you want to, right? Because they're not going to say, I don't care about parenting them. This is actually engaging a conversation and having them feel comfortable coming to you and discussing the ways in which they could parent better, giving you the opportunity to then present resources.
Yes. And so we want to really think about, what we're talking about here is empathy, respect, dignity, right? And that anything that if I need to defend myself, if I need to hide things, right? Which a lot of time is the norm when it comes to substance use and any other stigmatized experience, including, being a survivor of abuse, being trafficked, being a parent who uses substances, right? All of the kind of intersecting and going on non-judgmental, empathetic, and to treat people with respect and dignity, especially if we are having a hard time understanding what they're going through or the choices that they seem to be making. So the times where we might want to, or where judgment might come in kind of the strongest, it's the time that it's the most important to be aware of that and to kind of put that aside. Doesn't mean we neglect it, right? We might talk about that with a trusted colleague or with a trusted supervisor, right? We might kind of work through that. We might journal about it, reflect on it. But in the moment with that survivor, to be able to go, oh yeah, there's that stigma coming up, or, ooh, I'm feeling a judgmental thought. Like, let me put that over here in my little judgment jar. We'll come back to you later. But let me really tune into this person. Let me really just do my best in trying to understand what they're experiencing and how I could show up in a way that would be helpful and not add to the harm or add to the hardship. And this image here, it comes from the Pregnancy and Substance Use Harm Reduction Toolkit from the National Harm Reduction Coalition and the Academy of Perinatal Harm Reduction. So there's a lot of great resources in this toolkit. And then of course, these organizations have a lot of great resources in general. And then something that can be confusing for children is about their parents' substance use, is when they kind of notice that something might be going on, but it's kind of, it's a secret, right? It's something that they're not supposed to talk about, or it's something that doesn't get talked about. And we know that all of that is part of the survival, right? That when people have been literally turned away or exited from life-saving programming because of substance use, that not talking about the substance use has become part of survival, right? And so we can understand why that happens in general, and of course in families. And at the same time, sometimes that can feel really confusing for children. And so we want to, whenever parents or caregivers are ready to talk about their substance use with their children, if they ever feel like they're ready or it's safe to do so, we want to support them in helping them to share information that is simple, that is fact-based, and that is age appropriate. So a lot of times, as parents start to establish some stability, start to feel safer, right? Then they also start to look at, okay, well, I want to be able to talk with my child around some of the things that have been going on that they may have noticed, right? But we often fumble in kind of how to do that, right? And so something across the board is that, kids don't really want to hear kind of all the details of their parents' substance use. But parents sometimes, in their quest for being transparent, might not be sure exactly how much is too much detail and what information is actually helpful. And so that is a beautiful place for us to really support parents and caregivers. Something else here that can be helpful is that even if parents or caregivers aren't ready to talk about their specific substance use, we can still support them in helping them talk about just talk in general with their children, right? To be able to say, you know what, I'm really tired today and I'm going to need to take a nap. So do you want to take a nap too today? Or would you want to, read a book while I take a nap? Or, can we get you some coloring, get you set up? Or get you playing some video games while I take a nap. You can wake me up if anything comes up, right? These are really kind of normative things that any parent will ask of their child once their child is old enough to kind of self-manage, of course. But that for somebody who maybe hasn't had the safety to really be able to do that with their child, that they could maybe use some support around how to even ask for that, right? How to set that up, what to put in place. And so there are a lot of ways that we can support that parent-child communication. And then in supporting child-parent communication specifically around substance use, there are a whole lot of materials available to really help that. So there's a bunch from the National Association for Children of Addiction, as well as a project that Sesame Street did. So one pamphlet that's really helpful that comes from NACOA is called Start with the Heart. There's also different kinds of materials for different ages. There's videos, there's coloring pages, there's picture books, there's also activity books, and there are things for older kids and teens as well as the littles. And so, there's a lot there that people can explore. And that said, sometimes we get the question, well, how do I talk about parent substance use with a child when the parent hasn't disclosed that? And I'm so happy when I get that question, because the answer is that you don't, right? You don't undermine a person as a parent, right? You support them in their parenting. And you can always talk with a child, if a child brings it up to you, about how they're feeling. What's the story they tell themselves about how their parent, what they're noticing in their parent? And you can always support that child without undermining their parent. And then for programs that may have an integrated clinician or someone on staff who is doing some of that parent-child or two-generation support, here are some evidence-based interventions that can help. Now, the first thing I'll say is that it doesn't matter how effective the clinical program is that you have or that the person has access to in the community. If they're experiencing problems related to transportation, to childcare, to food insecurity, or to stigma, it's not worth much, right? So anything that we do always has to first and foremost address these barriers. But then from there, you might find these programs in your community, or you may be able to offer them within your program. And I want to highlight, anything that you see that is blue and underlined will be an active link in the PDF of the slides. And then you'll see here that Celebrating Families, there's an English version, there's a Latin American and Spanish language version, and then there's also a Native American version of those. So now moving into the final segment here, where we're going to actually talk through what this can look like in practice, right? So we're going to go through a couple of scenarios. In case you missed the first part of this series, I wanted to just, reintroduce, or maybe it can just be a little quick refresher on this framework known as drug set setting. So when we are really being careful with our assumptions, when we are avoiding and resisting the judgment, right? And really actively choosing to use non-judgmental and non-stigmatizing approaches, something that can be really helpful as we move away from that kind of all or nothing thinking around substance use is this framework. And so we have first the drug, and that is the substance itself, how we're getting it into our body, how much we're using, and ultimately the way that it affects us, in our brains and our bodies. Our brains are part of our bodies, of course, but we always talk about it as a separate thing, right? And then from there, thinking about the set. The set is everything happening kind of inside of us. It's our mindset, it's our disposition, it's our physical health, whether or not we've eaten that day, if we're dealing with any other kind of health conditions, whether or not we've slept that day, right? If we've slept well or had a really rough night's sleep, as well as what are our own kind of cultural views of the substance use? And then what do we expect from the experience? Are we using because we're feeling a lot of emotional pain and we are expecting to just be able to relax? Are we using because we're feeling festive and we're looking to celebrate, right? Kind of like, what's our mindset and expectation going into that experience? And then finally, the setting. everything around us, including the time of day, where we're using, whether or not I need to hide my use, who's around when I'm using, and what is the kind of like societal norm in general around that use. An example is we've seen a lot of cultural norms on a societal level starting to shift around cannabis use, for example. So looking at, what are the kind of norms in my community, and is that potentially driving the need to hide or a sense of internalized shame? Because what we do know is that when there is shame or guilt or needing to hide use, then we do tend to see more negative substance use experiences. So now going into our first scenario.
Yes, so we are going to start with Sabrina. I will read her scenario just in case, and then we're going to ask you to, while I'm reading, think about how you would respond. And then we're going to put Sabrina in that drug set setting framework. Sabrina recently entered the residence with her 3-year-old daughter. She smokes methamphetamine 1 to 2 times per day on most days. She typically begins using in the morning, sometimes uses again during her daughter's nap. She tends to only eat at night as she starts to experience withdrawal. Sabrina is an attentive parent, but sometimes struggles to get up in the morning if she had trouble falling asleep the previous night. Sometimes she uses another substance to fall asleep at night, which largely depends on what she can find. She has used alcohol, heroin, opioid pills, anti-anxiety pills, and cannabis in the past to try to fall asleep. Sabrina expresses that it's harder to fall asleep when she feels itchy or when she feels like she needs to stay awake to protect herself or her daughter. So start thinking about how you would respond. And we are watching the chat for your answers. Do you think it would be easier? We could go to the next slide and talk about it in our framework, if that would give you some ideas.
Yeah, here we go.
So this helps to break it down, putting it within the drug. So she said she smokes meth 1 to 2 times a day and sometimes uses other substances. She eats only at night, uses other substances when she has trouble falling asleep or when she feels itchy or feels like she needs to stay awake. Entered with her 3-year-old daughter and is an attentive parent, but sometimes struggled to get up in the morning. So what could you do to support Sabrina and her child? Could you, we're going to start by listening to what she feels that she needs more assistance with. Oh, well, okay, Andrea put in the chat, maybe we could offer her over-the-counter medications to help with sleep, right? So you could talk about other alternatives. She has expressed to you that sleep is something she's struggling with, right? So are there other ways that we could assist her with sleep? Help her get up in the morning if she's, if her, one of the anxieties around falling asleep maybe is, I'm afraid that I won't be able to wake up in the morning when my daughter's awake. Maybe she could be, staff could say, well, what about at 7 a.m. we'll start checking in your room, right, with you. Go ahead, Gabriella.
Yeah, and I was just gonna say, empathizing, right? Like it is hard to get up in the morning with a young child who is raring to go. And it's like, oh my goodness, I just need to sleep, right?
Mm-hmm. So, right, remember our age here, 3 years old, woo!
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And
right?
so even just empathizing, like, yeah, it's hard to get up in the morning with a 3-year-old, right? And when are some times that it's easier? And what are some things that we could do that might make it easier, right? Is it helpful to like have the coffee on?
Mm-hmm.
You can look forward to that cup of coffee.
Mm-hmm. Is it helpful to grab quick breakfast snacks that the child likes, so that's one less thing mom has to worry about waking up in the morning? Yep, somebody said discussing her routine. Food in the morning may help her feel energized. Yeah, maybe you could talk about how she's only eating once a day, right? Does she feel like she needs any support surrounding that? Is that her preference on eating? Ask her what her biggest problems are. Like you kind of mentioned there, she may benefit from some like meditation or mindfulness activities if she's struggling with sleep, right?
Yes. And then
Yes.
also looking at, right, so we can tell, even though it's just like a snapshot of, a little vignette, but we can tell that Sabrina's thinking about, when is it harder to sleep? What's keeping me from being able to sleep well? And so it seems like something that she values, right? That she wants to be able to sleep better. And I would say that that's usually the case, right? Like usually it's very distressful when we're not able to sleep well. And so I love here what Natalie said. Ask her what would help her feel safer, right? So building that self-defined emotional and physical safety. I remember working with somebody so that we had actually like sleigh bells, and we'd put them on the door to their room, and they felt a lot safer and they could sleep better because they knew that the sleigh bells were gonna make that kind of jingly sound if somebody opened it. And so they felt like they could relax and sleep, right? Now then, if you have maybe a roommate who's coming in and out a lot, that might be a new problem. So this is where it becomes nuanced, and we need to kind of figure out solutions within that specific situation.
Right. And like in that case, could you have the roommate, maybe make a room preference where everyone knocks before they enter, even if it's their room? Like a courtesy two little knock, let you know I'm coming in. I saw Carrie put in the chat, I would also ask if she had noticed this in the past and how she found ways to make it work in the past. It's a great idea, right? Sometimes they already have their own solution. They just need help finding it. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And asking whether, trouble sleeping is something that is kind of new as they recently entered this new situation, or is it something they've been dealing with for a while? What have they already tried, right? What's been helpful?
And I would caution you from letting your overly curious souls wander away, because pay attention to what she is pointing out as the issue, not other things that you like are dying to dive into, right? Like you're dying to dive into this methamphetamine use and you really want to address it, but like if you start with what she's focused on, you will probably eventually get there, right? Like, so, okay, let's say, 2 months down the line, she's sleeping better. She's feeling settled. She's feeling much safer. And maybe she's not using these other substances that she used to use to kind of like fill in the gaps when she needed it. So maybe now she's sleeping much better and she's ready to talk more openly with you about her use. Like you will probably get there, but you have to pay attention to her survivor-driven approach, right?
Yes. Everything we do needs to move at the speed of trust. And this is exactly how we build trust. It doesn't come from trying to force a conversation, from trying to control the outcome, right? And then thinking about, right, when she's feeling itchy, what might help there, right? What has she tried? What would she want to talk about? Some different things that could be helpful if she's feeling itchy. Is there a kind of soothing lotion? Is there an oatmeal bath, right? Kind of what's going to help with that? And then this is where it also can be helpful to know some of those harm reduction pieces to be able to offer, keeping, and with permission, of course, if Sabrina's interested in kind of talking about this, but things like keeping nails short and clean can help avoid skin infections if she is itching, right? And then I saw folks mentioning the eating, right? That there can certainly be some loss of appetite that could be related to methamphetamine use, could also just be related to stress, right? A lot of times people, when they're in a new place, when they're feeling, when they're feeling a lot of heavy stress, like that also impacts our appetite. And so making it really easy to eat. What are her comfort foods? What can we just pick up some groceries so that she feels more at home? She feels like it's one less thing to worry about. And then some things that can be helpful are kind of grab and go things. And things that are high in protein as well as high in electrolytes. So maybe like some bananas or some yogurt cups, right? Some protein bars, things like that.
Yeah, and I was actually thinking about it, like while you were talking, Gabriella, the other point to make is if your first instinct when you read this scenario was to instantly react to the fact that there was a child living with someone who's, actively using substances, pause and ask yourself, how is the child actually being affected by the substance use? Because in this case, they really aren't, right? If anything, how the child's being affected, they would be affected by any parent who is losing sleep, right? Who's not getting adequate sleep. So anyone who has issues sleeping, which is often a lot of people in communal living, right? They don't sleep well in communal living. I wouldn't sleep well in communal living. So tired, maybe like she self-identified she's struggling to get up in the morning, right? So I think keeping it framed around like the need of the parent and how they're expressing it will ultimately help the child, right? If that's the kind of direction when you read it you came at. And something we found useful, speaking of communal living and its difficulties, in our shelter, if you could see it, it's comically old and small, and it's 4 bedrooms shared by all. So what we do, like we have upstairs like a second living room essentially, and what we've done in the past when there's been people who really struggle with communal living and around sleep especially, is give like time that they could have that room to themselves. So you could even suggest like, hey, an hour or two before bedtime, you want us to like, mark that room off just for your all's use. You could watch a relaxing TV show. You could listen to some music with your child. You could do some yoga. Like what do you need? Like how can we use the room that we have, even though it's not sufficient? Like how do we work with what we have to best fit needs?
Yes. And then this is too where that strengths-based approach can be so helpful. Just like, okay, when has it been easier to fall asleep, to stay asleep? When have you felt more comfortable? And really building on those moments, because a lot of times we just naturally focus on the problem, right? The thing that is distressing us. So then focusing on when is the problem slightly less, as she defines it, right? As she defines the problem.
Any other thoughts on Sabrina before we move on to Cece? All right, we will move on to Cece. So once again, I'll read it, and while reading it, start considering thinking about how your program would respond. Cece and her 7 children accessed housing in the Scattered Site program 3 months ago. Cece has sporadically utilized case management services since entering the program, often stating that she's just too busy between the kids and her job search, and there's no one to help her with the kids. This morning, you received a complaint from the landlord stating that he saw Cece smoking some kind of drug, definitely not a cigarette, on her balcony last night. He states that when he asked her where her kids were, she said they were inside playing video games. I see a comment in the log about being mandated reporters. Mandated reporting, particularly in DV programs, depends on state and local laws. We were going the same place. One of us. And then I was going to also say transparency is the next step to mandated reporting. So yes, exactly what she said. But being transparent, knowing your own laws and being transparent. And again, also considering not only knowing your requirement to report, but knowing what your state defines as like a child, an endangered child, right? Like just the presence of a substance. Does the child have to be in the presence of an adult when they're using the substance? Like there are usually, it differs by state.
Yeah. So what I'll mention there is that many states will equate parental substance use with child abuse or neglect. Many states won't. So unless you actually are noticing signs of abuse or neglect, then it wouldn't be something that would be mandated reporting. Like, for example, in the state of Alabama, the code reads, and they're very different. So that's why it's important to know your code. But in the state of Alabama, if there is somebody who is sober and above age 12, then that is not considered child abuse or neglect if a parent is under the influence. And then also what has been found is that actually there's a lot of research coming out right now that states that mandate reporting of substance use by parents when there's not signs of abuse or neglect otherwise present, that it actually forms a deterrent from parents going to treatment, and it actually ends up being more harmful and dangerous. And so there's a couple different articles that have come out recently showing that in states where there are those kind of heavy policies, there's actually higher rates of things like, maternal overdoses and babies being born exposed to substances and things like that, because it is a barrier to getting help. And I'm happy to share those if folks are interested.
So we can go ahead to the next slide so you can see this in the drug set setting, if that helps. I know it helps me sometimes to see it broken down. I did see some people already saying I would let the client know what the landlord said, right? Like communicate what you heard. But remember, we're communicating that in a not judgmental and shaming way. Advocate with the landlord. I saw someone say that, like, I would talk to the landlord about the kids being safe. Yeah, this is when your systems advocacy comes in, right? And you advocate across the board for the client and the safety of the children. Heads up and ask the clients. Yeah, and we've kind of been told what her needs are, right? Childcare is a huge need for 7 children. That's not easy to find. It's also not easy to afford, right? Affordable, reliable childcare, particularly. And in the case of childcare, I think there's also a pretty dangerous rhetoric that, like, an individual living in poverty or an individual who's struggling to find childcare should just take the first one that, like, becomes available. So, well, that, daycare down the street said they would do it for $20 a day, but when the client went to check it out, didn't quite feel good, maybe has a child with a disability who requires some sort of specialty care, wasn't quite sure about that. We wouldn't hold ourselves to that same standard, right? Like, we wouldn't say, just settle on the first child care provider you find. So know that freedom of choice is important, right, for parents, and not just saying, well, a resource presented itself and you didn't take it, so clearly you're not actually worried about childcare. They are worried about childcare. They're worried about adequate, proper, appropriate, safe childcare for their child, especially if there's 7 of them. That's a lot of children to find childcare for, right? Make sure, you talk with the landlord about, particularly, we run a rapid rehousing program. The amount of, like, veiled threats that we get from landlords about evictions chronically, it's almost laughable. So learning how to, like, navigate and mitigate those sort of things when they come up, the language, how to talk about it. And maybe if you do get to the point, I saw Robert's comment where you're able to have a conversation with the survivor openly about this use, you could even say, like, let's say the client says, well, I get so stressed out, like, this is with the kids, like, this is what helps me sort of, like, live in my own reality. You could even talk about how, like, how great it was, like, you took a second away from the children to take care of your needs, right? And maybe before you might have done it in front of the children. So this is a step toward, the positive direction. Use of case management services prior, what was helpful? Yeah, can the case management services become more flexible? Is it where the case manager is just saying, I have every other Wednesday at 1 open, you either take it or lose it, right? Like, looking at how services are offered and where they're offered. What about, can the kids come to case management? Can the case manager bring someone else from their staff to sit with the kids while they're doing case management? Could they do it at a park so the kids could play? Like, sort of adapting services surrounding the survivor's needs. I don't know, Gabriella, did you have any other thoughts about CC?
Yeah, I love what everyone is putting in the chat is so great. And what I would add is just, always being aware of how people experience a level of surveillance in their lives that is really based on their socioeconomic status and nothing else, right? That if this was, CC owned her own apartment and was just living in a community, it would be very unlikely that anybody would be calling anyone to talk about what CC is or isn't doing. And so I love how all of you are not jumping to conclusions, are remaining strengths-based, and are also remaining reality-based in looking at, how can we be of service? And that part of the services that we offer is housing advocacy, helping to manage landlord relationships, so that landlords don't just kind of get stuck, surveilling our person, and that they feel confident. But that doesn't mean that we stop kind of advocating for the person in our services. So we are always advocating for them, and that part of that advocacy is maintaining those landlord relationships, even when, as long as it's still the person wants to live there, it's healthy for the person to live there. Because sometimes from having spent a very long time in scattered site housing, sometimes some landlords just decide that they have something against somebody. And we just know that discrimination exists, and that there's going to be times where, in order for that person to have safe and stable housing, we're going to need to move them with their choice. We don't, just move people because we think so, but that they say, I don't feel comfortable with this landlord constantly watching me and, reporting me for nothing, right? And then we work with that person until we can find the kind of best fit for them where they can feel comfortable and have what they need.
Yeah, and we don't know a lot about it in just her scenario, but talking about what any protective factors she may have within her community, within her apartment complex. Like you said, have you made any friends? Like, what about, do they have kids that the kids could play with, like, as a distraction, whatever. So really exploring what resources she already has access to, and how we could maybe make that access easier could be beneficial in this case too.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Any other thoughts on CC before we move on? All right, I think it's back to you now, Gabriella.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. So kind of in summary, we wanted to leave a fair amount of time for question answer, because we know that there's a lot of burning questions that come up around parents and caregivers, and particularly around substance use. So kind of in summary, the things that you want to really hold front and center is addressing stigma within yourself, your programs, helping staff members and colleagues to address stigma, addressing stigma in other systems in the community at large, and using non-judgmental approaches. And recognizing that parental substance use does not automatically mean that children are unsafe. And that if there is a safety concern for any reason, right, we want to support parents, caregivers, and families. We want to support them. We want to offer resources that they find relevant, not offer a resource that they're going to say, wow, this person's really judging me. That's not helpful, right? Affirming and building on those parent and caregiver and family strengths. And, kind of no matter the level of support that someone may request in that moment, always still respecting them as the parent, as the caregiver, right? Promoting those protective factors, being aware of them, affirming them, strengthening them, and supporting positive attachment and communication between parents, caregivers, and their children. Families are incredibly resilient. There's, as much as there can be conflict, there's also a lot of strengths. And so really supporting that positive attachment, and it doesn't have to be, it can be something as simple as like movie night, popcorn. It can be things that feel small but have large ripple effects. And then whenever there is either a desired system involvement or maybe a system involvement that was not desired, always advocating for survivors and their children, and understanding that the stigma related to substance use is often used against survivors to isolate them from sources of safety and stability. So countering that stigma is really core to the advocacy that we do with survivors of human trafficking. And so there are more resources here, and in the follow-up email, there'll be more resources. And of course, we want to thank you for your time today and open it up for questions.
Awesome. First, thank you everyone for being here today. Thank you, Katie and Gabriella. So just like what was mentioned, if you have questions, I know Katie and Gabriella have answered them throughout the chat today during our conversation. We'll go off some questions that have been submitted right now. And then if there are other questions that come up, put them in the Q&A and we'll go with those as well. So I think one of the first questions that we've had asked that you two kind of started to allude to towards the end is interacting with landlords, right? And or evictions or just more of that scattered site rental assistance housing. And one of the questions that has come in is, how do you deal with evictions that occur because of substance use? So it kind of focuses on that next set of intersection, right? That housing and the eviction process because of substance use. Gabriella, do you want to start with that? And then Katie, you may even have some direct service experience too on how you all have navigated. So we'd love to hear your perspective as well.
Absolutely. And so it all depends on what it is that is the, area of concern. What is the lease violation? If a landlord is reporting lease violations. And so the first thing we need to do is really focus on what is the behavior that is being stated. What is the, resident in our program? What is their experience of it? And then hopefully we've been able to build that, we've been able to kind of earn trust and extend ourselves in ways that are trustworthy and build relationship so that we can just have some real talk about this person's, the landlord's complaint and what's hard, what's going on with it. Is there a kernel of truth? Is it, is it the neighbor that the landlord is thinking about, but they're picking on our resident because they know that our resident is in a program, right? So kind of just what's going on? And being able to have real talk about that, and then being able to make a plan together. So I know that one that was very common when I was doing scattered site housing was just high traffic. A lot of people coming in and out, and that not only coming in and out, but that going into kind of the evening hours when people were trying to sleep and what have you. And so just being able to talk with folks around, okay, what makes it hard to once you're in and you don't leave until later, or you leave quietly in and out. And do they have an understanding of, is the building clear about kind of what quiet hours are? Because living in an apartment building, I remember having neighbors that would be playing the piano and singing at 3 a.m. And it was their piano playing and singing was beautiful. And I needed to get up in a few hours for work, right? So whether or not there's substance use involved, this is just part of managing community living. And so what would be helpful as that person is learning to manage in that community setting? And so, if it's part of, sometimes it's something as simple as having a large family. And so a lot of people are visiting because you've been blessed with a large family. Cool, right? But that can get really misconstrued by somebody who doesn't understand the situation. So not focusing specifically on the substance use unless that person has said to you, it's because of the substance use. And then we can have a conversation about that. Okay, if we're going in and out in order to get more substances, what would happen if it kind of pre-planned and had that, substances by a certain hour, and then once you're out, you're out. What does that look like, right? So really being able to have some real talk and safety plan around those things, because there's also plenty of people who use substances and don't come to their landlord's attention. And so, how can we support somebody in that way? And then there are times that, there's not really, whatever the housing violation isn't really what's going on. And it's much more just kind of targeting of our client and needing to really advocate for that person.
Yeah, and I would just add to know the culture of the community in which you work surrounding this work. So I live from West Virginia, work in West Virginia. We have a state that just tried to legislatively eliminate harm reduction and mandated drug testing for SNAP benefits. So we're not floating in like a very accepting culture here. So I think understanding what like this landlord is hearing from the society that they live in and the culture that they live in, and kind of starting there. So also treating a landlord like any other person in crisis, because according to them right now, they feel that this issue with your client is a crisis. So letting them be heard, validating their feelings, even if maybe they're not right. And just sort of working through, kind of like Gabriella said, like pinpointing what is the actual problem, and then throwing resources at the actual problem rather than just, letting it explode.
Awesome. Thank you for the both of you. We had a couple, while going through that question, we had a couple come through our chat as well here right now. And I wanted to kind of start with the question that Natalie posed to us. Do you have any specific tips for prosecutors and or lawyers based on clients' experience and their feedback? So Natalie, I might need a little bit of clarification. Would that be on kind of housing and survivors using in housing, or just even kind of fighting evictions or stuff like that too? Unless Gabriella or Katie, you have a different interpretation that you can maybe see the route that Natalie was going with that.
I think more information would be helpful for me at least.
Okay. So yeah, Natalie, if you're still on, if you want to even put even some more information in the chat too, we could maybe take that question live here. I was thinking about how to be survivor focused in a legal setting. So, okay. So yeah, Gabriella or Katie, either one of you want to start with that specifically?
Yes, absolutely. So this is where, there can be a lot of training that can be helpful so that judges and other court personnel can have trauma-informed courtrooms to the best of their ability. The system itself is not necessarily trauma-informed, but to the best of their ability. And so, having that continuing education and offering CLEs and all that good stuff. And then at the National Center, we actually have something called the Trauma-Informed Legal Advocacy Project, the TILA project. And so that has a lot of case-based learning that focuses on trauma-informed legal advocacy. So that might be a good resource.
Yeah, that was going to be my exact suggestion. There's so many resources on it, specifically within your work. And what I found most beneficial is we have, like in West Virginia, Violence Against Women prosecutor specializes in that. And her coming in and doing like technical assistance, because it's difficult to operate in a survivor-driven way if that's not the stance of everyone that within your office, right? So like doing some agency work as well could be beneficial.
Thank you. And I think Natalie too, right? There are some beautiful things that Gabriella and Katie went over today, that even as a lawyer and or a prosecutor, there are some skills and ways to approach serving human trafficking survivors that may have are actively using while helping them in that legal setting, and or going through court hearings and different things like that. So I think there are just even some skills too as a lawyer and a prosecutor that were kind of reviewed today as well. Gerald has another question here in our chat. Are there ways to better involve church organizations aligned with individual preferences? So I kind of, again, interpreting, are there ways to kind of work with, do that community outreach with church and or faith-based organizations to kind of get on board with survivor autonomy, right, and individual choice with substance use, that might be parents and or guardians. So Katie, do you mind kind of starting with the work that you all are doing?
Sure, yeah. And I mean, our philosophy is sort of you can find resources anywhere. And as long as you know all of the ins and outs of that resource, or as much as you can, and you're not setting someone up for failure, it would certainly be appropriate to refer to a religiously based program if that's something the survivor identifies as wanting. Again, West Virginia, we have very limited religious diversity around these parts. So I think in the case where maybe there is like a specific religious preference that we don't have, faith-based preference that we don't have nearby, doing the research, finding one, how do we get them there, transportation, like the same almost as any other resource, knowing the ins and outs of it. For example, West Virginia opened a residential facility for survivors of human trafficking, like specifically for them. And just on the surface, if you were to look at it, it would be like, oh yeah, this is like, okay. But when you read the fine print, which it's still, you know, is possible, it specifically says will only serve females who identify as female at birth. So they are actively not serving non-binary individuals, trans individuals, male identifying individuals. So knowing that piece and making sure that you're not setting up a survivor for discrimination would be very important. But other than that, it would certainly be appropriate to use as a resource.
Yeah, and what I would add to that is that, you know, there's a lot of survivors who, where they're first going to reach out or what they're first going to have access to is a faith-based community, or a faith leader, particularly in communities where, you know, the resources may not be immediately apparent, right? Where it can be hard to find the resources. And so being able to cross-train kind of local faith communities and leaders to be able to be responsive to survivors, to be able to support survivors in order to establish safety. So they don't have to be like the human trafficking expert, right? But what they do need to know is how to respond in a way that is helpful if somebody seeks help with them, and then how to get them to the human trafficking expert in their community, right? And so there are a couple organizations that focus specifically on supporting faith communities and have really great resources that you could share in your outreach of local faith communities and in relationship building. And that is the Faith Trust Institute, as well as a Safe Haven Interfaith Partners. So they have really, really great resources on, you know, to the point of even like sample sermons for clergy members of different faiths to really have kind of an anti-violence faith community.
That's awesome. Thank you, Gabriella, for sharing those resources as well. Would you mind just popping those in the chat too? So if anyone didn't catch those, I think that would be fantastic. We also had another question come through, which I think is often a question that a lot of providers and or community members have when talking about this intersection. So the question is, what do you do if the survivor doesn't want to discuss harm reduction? Do we just ignore the substance use?
I was so happy to see that question.
Yes, I think it's a great question and oftentimes one that goes unasked. So I agree. I appreciate that. Katie, do you want to go ahead and start with your experience with this question? And then I think Gabriella would be great to bring in your perspective as well on this.
Yeah, that is a great question. And my answer would be you absolutely don't ignore it, but also you don't focus. It doesn't have to be the focus. So for example, my question would be, how do you actually know that this person is using substances? And sometimes you can tell, right? They physically present as if, you know, they're using a substance, or you might have heard about it from another resident, or maybe they did tell you, but they were like, I don't need any of your, you know, harm reduction stuff. So one thing that has been helpful, think about it as if you're working with a survivor that is not accepting another service that you offer. So imagine that you have a support group for, okay, let's make it a very general, it's a human trafficking peer support survivor group. And like, so every resident that comes in your program would benefit from attending, you could argue, right? You could argue that. And this one resident isn't attending it. The solution, right, wouldn't be, oh, well, they must not care about getting better as a survivor, right? So instead, you make the service available consistently, right? Consistent. So even if they're not accepting the harm reduction services right now, they're still there. They're still present, provided, available whenever they're needed. And then you focus on what the survivor needs. So what are they telling you they want to focus on? I want to focus on getting a job. I want to focus on getting my license. I want to focus on getting a car. Like, just do that, right? And then keep the resources flowing, keep the conversation open. And then let's say we have a survivor that we've worked with for a while. She lived in our residential shelter setting for a while, and she was very open about her substance use and did not engage in many services. And my, advocates would come and say, I'm just not sure how to. And I was like, well, observe, what does she do in the day? Does she eat dinner? You could just eat dinner with her. Does she sit outside on the porch? You could just sit outside on the porch with her. It's a social work skill called engage in the medium of the other. So you literally just do what they're doing with them. That's how you build a relationship, right? And that would get them talking, get them involved in services, get them, whatever. And you'd be able to figure out what they want, need, hope for, enjoy, thrive in.
I love everything you just said, Katie. I love, love, love that. And I see other people here in the chat are saying the same thing. That's awesome. The only thing I would add is that, so a few things actually. People need to be able to push us away before they can invite us in. When I have had, my boundaries constantly violated, when I have been under a person's control, then as for someone to say no to us, that is such a beautiful sign of healing, right? That is such a beautiful sign of healing. So to really honor that, to really respect that. And as people see that we respect their no, that even when maybe they just start to kind of appear disinterested, maybe they haven't even said no, they just kind of appear disinterested, that we slow down and check in hey, I've put a lot out there. I want to check in with you. How are you? What do you think? Would it be helpful to talk more about this, or, would it be helpful to move on? Right. So even that level of tuning in to people's nonverbals and respecting their consent is so incredibly healing, right? And that consistency and that trust is what is really going to open up conversation down the road. So that's one thing. Another thing I would say is, how can we make the information available without requiring conversation around it? So in one of my programs, we had a handout that we downloaded from the Harm Reduction Coalition that was like a checklist for overdose prevention. And I can tell you that a lot of people we worked with hesitated to talk to us around overdose prevention. And we would continue to bring it up because obviously we're in the middle of a drug poisoning epidemic. At the same time, we would also just have the material freely available. And I can tell you that that was the handout that I had to print more copies and replace the most. Right? So how can we make, information and resources available without requiring that self-disclosure? And then the last thing I'll say is hiring people with lived experience and hiring people who openly talk about their lived experience, that peer connection, right? That there were so many times that people did not want to talk to anyone else on staff, but when it came to our peer-based support, it was a constant desire to talk with our peer-based support specialists. So that's another way to also really help foster some of that openness.
Awesome. Well, Katie and Gabriella and everyone else still here on the last 2 minutes of our call, thank you for just joining us and talking about this intersection of substance use and housing while serving human trafficking survivors, and specific to, parents and guardians this time around. So for anyone with us, just a reminder, we have access to the part 1 of substance use and housing in our resource library. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see the link to our resource library, as well as just our Freedom Network website as well. And if you have any questions or further support on this topic, please reach out to training@freedomnetworkusa.org. And thank you again for being here today. And we hopefully talk soon. Again, I feel like there's more conversation of other intersections that we could talk about in the future. Thank you, everyone.